Pizza the American way. Pizza and beer with the gang after the Saturday night movie is an American tradition. But leave it to trendy Los Angeles to create a new, elegant twist to the traditional pizza here at the very in spot of Spago. Restaurateur Wolfgang Puck creates the ultimate pizza.
We have all sorts of different pizzas. You know, we have a duck sausage pizza, we have the Santa Barbara shrimp pizza, the lamb sausage pizza. Oh, you know, our famous Don Marino pizza. I think we use really fresh ingredients for it, like duck sausage or lamb sausage or fresh shrimps from the ocean here. So I think it's really much more interesting than most of the pizzas you could find in any pizza parlor. And it's more expensive a little bit, and that's why we use it for, instead to drink Coca-Cola or beer with it, we drink good champagne with it. You know, a restaurant is only as good as the customers who go there.
Nobody loves entertaining eaters more than Wolfgang Puck.
With shrimp pizza or sausage pizza from the oceans. I mean, I'm trying my best to do my best Austrian Germanic accent, but truly, I had no idea about so many things related to Spago, like the advent of the salmon pizza and how that was a direct result of, you know, having to feed Joan Collins and having run out of bread that day. But we're going to have a really fun episode today. I've been so excited about this. Actually, I probably prepared more and in a way that didn't feel like preparation for this than any other episode of any form of podcastery I've ever done before, because it is just pure joy and exploration.
What does that say about us?
We're talking about Spago. You heard Wolfgang Puck. Spago plays prominently in our main segment today because today of all days, we get to explore soft, yacht, and perhaps most importantly, this thing called Spago Rock with two special guests, Mike Pace and Molly Lambert. You're listening to Waiting to Exhale, a show about the forgotten generation and everything you've forgotten about Generation X. I wonder if our theme song is Soft Yacht or Spago. Here it is.
Waiting to exhale. Waiting to exhale. Waiting to exhale. I'm waiting to exhale. I'm waiting to exhale. With Karen and Winter. Waiting to exhale. I know you're waiting.
Winter, before we get into all things Spago related, and I know that our guests, they're real experts in this, so I have a feeling we're going to get really deep in the discussion, but
we're going to get very deep into it. I just know it. I can tell.
Yeah. So, but I think that our subs this week, from what it looks like, are pretty resonant, and they're also resonant with the 80s thematic of what we're going with. So do you want to get started?
Well, listen, I want us to close the loop on physical, but I want to start. I told you last week to watch Dave because you're the intellect, you're the intellectual here, and I'm merely just a bystander for the ways of the white man. I'm curious your thoughts, and everybody should know that I love Dave. I think it's a really good show. I think I've talked about it in the past on the show that I think I didn't think anything about Little Dicky. I just thought he's making an attempt and he nails it pretty well, but I don't know what his aesthetic. I've spent time with him. I find him to be very intriguing and interesting. His public persona is very closely tied to his actual person, nebbish and sort of nervous and self-critical, but no competent, and so I think the show does a really good depiction. It depicts him very well of who he is as a rapper and as a character and an artist. But it's on season 2. It's been on for about 3 weeks now. It comes on FXX, and last week's episode was, I don't know what to call it. You had something that you wanted to, you called it, KT, that I couldn't you always come up with the best word.
The word that I used is the homosocial episode of Dave. And, like that term is something that has been in circulation for a long time to describe, these intense same-sex intimacies, often between men. There's a great queer theorist, Eve Sedgwick, who wrote about this in the 80s. And the distinction is it's homosociality, not homosexuality. So it is these forms of male bonding and intimacy that we could trace throughout so many forms of Western culture, from the Greeks through like Walt Whitman, through all these different things, right? That never quite broaches the completely sexual or what seems like the most explicitly sexual. And it also doesn't broach like an identity, but it is about that like male intimacy.
Right.
And so that's why I called it the homosocial episode of Dave, because that seemed to be like where the whole episode landed, or where it was framed. Like it opens like with an incredibly long montage of Dave and his friend. What was his friend's name?
Benny.
I can't remember that.
Benny.
Yes.
Like, Benny Blanco, who is a very big pop producer.
Yeah. So Benny and Dave, like, basically getting really physically intimate, but kind of shaking it off and playing like they're being like little boys. They're going like, "Oh, that's gross," or "Let me see your butt hair," or like, "Do you want to look at this?" Or like, and in between there are those flashes of tenderness, even though they're trying to like feel like they're fooling around, like, just kind of fooling around and stuff. There's another new book too that I just want to mention, that for folks who are interested in this kind of like, there's something almost fratty about it.
Yes.
And there's a book by a friend and colleague named Jane Ward called Not Gay.
Oh.
But she's a sociologist, and she actually did a lot of research about like these, especially in frats and in other environments where there's like intense same-sex bonding, and sometimes even that crosses over into the sexual, but it doesn't like, define or become an identity.
Right.
So that's a much newer book that if people are interested in, they can look at that. But I want to know, so like, I love that you like, like emailed me and texted me. I think you did both, because it really, sometimes it's like one or the other. When we're having ideas and we're thinking about the show, we'll just shoot a message in some way. But you hit me up on all forums because you're like, I need to see, I need to hear what's going
on this.
So that's what my opinion is. So I was like, I don't know. So that, I had a frame for it, but in terms of like how I processed it, I was like, what is this show trying to do with this?
Again, you're the intellectual, you're the scholar. I'm looking at it as, I always feel like that's just what men do. I really think that's what men do. I think that they will, depending on the company that they're in, they'll admit it. I think they were surprised that their homies who came over, who happened to be African-American, weren't that weirded out. I think they also anticipated that's just what they do. I think it's daring to show straight men who are not even, this wasn't even like a bi thing. I think Benny is definitely like, could have cruised into either direction, but Dave has gone out of his way to sort of, illustrate that he is a straight white dude. He's a straight dude, cis hetero. So I think it's daring, right? I don't think it's bold. I don't think it's bolder than anything we've seen with Pose. I don't think it's bolder than anything we've seen with a lot of the programming that is actually showing and illustrating what being in the LGBTQIA community is like. That to me is not daring. That should just be standard. I think it's daring to put men we are seeing like the effects of toxic masculinity, especially the overt versions of it so aggressively in the last, with the advent of social media, we can look right at it and see like the Karen and the Kens, but the toxic masculinity is so overt, and it's so couched in like, I don't want to be perceived as gay. I don't want to be perceived as weak. I don't want to be perceived as unable to perform sexually or physically. These like no flat booty having, Jewy fro type boys just rolling on this palatial hillside estate. It's just hilarious to me. And there were so many, it wasn't like playing with gender constructs or anything. I think that men who are, for the most part, curious and comfortable have done these things. And I think showing it on television is actually very helpful. And showing men who, in the same context of that episode, KT, like pining for women.
Mm-hmm. And I think that the fact that they are rich makes a difference. And I actually think that the way that that their wealth and their environs help make it easy for them to explore these things to a certain extent. Because I also thought it was pretty keen how the show handled like another voice to it with, like the two black guys just basically being like, look, there's already enough shit that we have to deal with in relation to the world and our behavior being policed and in relation to like all these different things. Like, you think I'm going to take the time to like look up his butthole? You know what I mean? Like, no, right?
Right.
And I think that what it drew was that kind of distinction and a different set of expectations for different guys and different bodies. And it's funny because the thing that I was talking about, homosociality, and like, as a kind of framework or concept, I mean, sure, like there's definitely a range of examples across different classes, but so often, especially when you think about the Greeks or Greek love and how that happened back in the day.
Right.
There's often people with a kind of power or privilege, right, who had the flexibility and the capacity to do that. Or there's also a kind of aristocratic tint to that when we think about these different things in the 19th century, thinking about somebody like Oscar Wilde or whatever, who did end up, of course, being gay, right? Or how we, understand it's like, but I see the point that you're making about how it makes like representing this in a kind of unflinching way makes it possible for people to also understand how to explore same-sex intimacy without maybe having an identity crisis about it. Yeah. Right. But again, it's kind of preserved for people who have that space, as the show points out. Right. But yeah. So it was interesting. It was super fascinating because when at first I wasn't sure which episode you meant. And because it took a minute for me to get like episode 3. So I was like, wait, is she wanting me to talk about that episode in Korea or this one? And then I was like, oh, okay, this is the one.
About Korea, but then I found out it wasn't made in Korea, so it made me less interested in that.
Yeah, for sure.
That episode, I really was hoping they went to Seoul, and that's really a testament how much they set dressed downtown little Tokyo to look like Seoul. No, but I want to talk to you about Physical because I think we both. I binged everything that was available, and I'm caught up. The new Apple TV show, Physical, is, what we're talking about. And like, of course, like you and I were both drawn to it. Obviously, the 80s aesthetic, aerobics. But let me tell you, those ads and the neon and the leg warmers did not prepare me for what this show really was like or about. I had a conversation yesterday with one of my best friends, and she was like, I just don't care about her inner monologue. And I said, but that's where you're missing the point. All women were having, like Rose Byrne's character, all they were having was that inner dialogue and that inner monologue with themselves. To me, that seems completely in line with early 1980s, coming out of the 70s, walking into the 80s, and having this expectation for women. Well, you should be out of the home by now. You should be at work. You should be doing this. And okay, you're not. Then what are you doing?
And all the body shame and self-loathing. I mean, I know that in different snippets, you and I have talked about this before.
Yeah.
But really, like when I talk, when I half-heartedly joke, like, well, I grew up in the 80s, so like I know starvation and slim fast. Like I really mean it. It was a culture that was so incredibly toxic around and that intensified toxicity around weight and body image and all this stuff. And, and that inner monologue to me, all of the self-loathing that she has that's attached to her eating disorder, but also just in her everyday life, comparing herself with other women and like expressing, this profound disgust for people who she fears she will be or become, based on their appearance or like their frumpiness or their style or what she deems as pathetic. Right. So like, there's so much seething anger there. But like, I think so many of us were having a version of that monologue that wasn't angry, but that was internalizing that stuff.
Right.
So it's interesting to see it like lashing out in these ways. It reminds me of that show that was only on for a season, Dietland.
Oh my God. That was such a glimmer and a blink in the eye.
Yeah.
Wow.
But it was also intense and unblinking about like this stuff in a way that I think,
I'm looking
kind
to
of
see if it's available online still.
I wonder if it is, but in a way that I think, as you're saying, that might alienate some people because they don't want to like be reminded that they have those thoughts.
Right. Right.
Interrupting them.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole premise being like we see somebody with an aerobics empire in 1986, and then we flash back to 81 or 82 and see how then like they get there. Right.
But I like that. I like that because think about Susan Powter's origin story, right? Remember her? That's her whole selling point.
Stop the insanity.
Stop the insanity. And it was like, and I was X amount of pounds and I was miserable and I was at home with the kids and my husband had left me or wasn't helping me or wasn't like, that's how they get women, right? Like that to me, that's why I feel like it's really telling story in a really, really great way, beyond just being like 1980 set, which is obviously the draw for us. Like I'm super fascinated by that. But I think starting with like, how do you even get to this point? Right. And like seeing that and I read an article, I forget who wrote it, but it was someone saying that becoming disillusioned with the freedom fighting aspect of being like, sort of like, how boom, like she's ostensibly, if Rose Byrne's character is still alive today, she's a boomer. So she's probably like my parents' age. And like, being raised into like, you're born into like a generation that's like, you're going to be a mom, you're going to stay at home. And then you go through that, this 20-year period where everybody's like, no, F that. You're going to get out into the workforce. You're going to change the world. You're going to do all these things. You're going to be like, fuck Nixon, do all these things. And then you slide right into a world that you have to conform to through the lens of a man, right? Like, big shoulder pads, working in an office, still, submitting and being to their whims and everything like that. Like, I find that interesting that she's doing all this stuff for her husband, whom I hate. There's no one to root for on this show. Everybody on this show sucks.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely like, it pushes the anti-heroine angle, but that guy, that actor, he was, Rory Scovel.
Hate him.
Who plays, I mean, he's so good at being so loathsome. And it's just like, it's a really like, you'll get lured in by the shininess, like I think we were, but I think that you'll stay for the depth of what it's like making you confront about the 80s that we sometimes lose in our halcyonic and nostalgic memories for those tunes and those lights and those leg warmers.
Can you clear up something for me? Or maybe I was just tired watching the last episode. When she comes home and she's pissed, rightfully so, she's, throughout the course of the show, she's trying to support her husband's he's running for like, what is it, city council or something like that in a beach city out here in SoCal.
San Diego.
Is it San Diego? Yeah. I thought it was.
I think they finally mentioned it was San Diego in the last episode.
Okay. So like he's running for something and she's helping him do fundraising. He's like weak and can't really do it, or is like, like one of those guys. Did he have a boner when she confronted him?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And she does not say anything. And I'm like, is he a boner right now?
Yes, a boner beneath his poncho, his party poncho. So yeah. Anyway, go check that out. Well, so gosh, speaking of the 80s, we're going to get deep into the 80s and its many sounds with two fantastic people. Molly Lambert, who's an amazing cultural critic, podcaster, has so many incredible shows to look into, a writer, and Mike Pace, a musician and composer who got into this thing called Spago Rock, which we're going to go deep on in our main segment. So we'll be right back right after this. Hey, everybody, it's Karen.
And Winter.
I know you probably don't even hear this call because it's at the very end credits of our show, but we're coming at you. We're coming at you in the middle of the
I have an announcement,
episode.
Karen.
Oh, Winter. Finally, that's some BOCO right there. That's a BOCO right there. Well, we're reaching out to you here in the middle of the episode to ask if you'll support us on Patreon. I know that everything seems so fun and cash, and like the show like magically appears out of nowhere, but there's a lot of hard work that goes into it, and especially from our producer, Allison Holly, who takes care of all the things you see out in the world, all of what you hear. We're a 3-woman operation. And so we're really very grateful that you've supported us through all this time. But tell a friend, listen to the show, drop a couple of bucks in the bucket, in the Patreon bucket. Yeah, Winter, what are some of the good reasons for people to be supporting us?
First of all, if you are a Gen Xer, you just want some adults in the room, don't you? You just want to hear from 2 adults who've got their shit together and they just want to talk to you like they're your friends. We're your friends. We're here to give you plain speaking, engaging conversation about the things we grew up listening, watching, seeing, experiencing, and how we respond to entertainment and pop culture in current day.
So support us in our endeavor on Patreon. Find us Waiting to Exhale podcast, and you'll hear the information again at the end of the show. So visit us on w2xpodcast.com. That's the letter W, the number 2, the letter X, podcast.com. And you'll find all the things you need to find there to support us by buying merch or by joining our Patreon. Enjoy the rest of the show. Welcome back to Waiting to Exhale. I'm Karen Thompson.
And I'm Winter Mitchell-Vorba.
And today joining us, we have 2 very special guests, folks who have deep and profound knowledge of the genres that we're going to be talking about today, soft, yacht, and spago rock. In fact, the founder, the kind of the person from whom the concept of spago rock, whose mind that sprung, is here today. Molly Lambert, cultural critic extraordinaire, and Mike Pace. Welcome, both of you.
Well, thank you so much. It's amazing to be able to. I think this is the first time spago rock has been discussed on a podcast. So, congrats on getting the scoop, guys. Big.
Wow, I'm glad to be part of this historic summit on spago rock.
It is a historic summit, I feel. Also, like, because, you know, I can't believe that it hasn't been discussed yet, but I'm looking forward to, I'm very excited about, you know, how we're going to parse the fine details of these 3 things that we talked about: soft, yacht, spago, which I love saying over and over again in repetition in a series together. You know, Winter, you're the one who really prompted this episode, because in our last ep, I don't even know how it started. You brought up Kenny G. Kenny G was your song of the week.
Yes, he was.
And then you got a conversation started on Twitter, and a bunch of us participated in that. Tell folks a little bit about what prompted these contemplations.
As everyone heard in our last episode, I played Songbird, right, by Kenny G. And it just immediately took me to a time and an era that was, for myself, I can't speak for others, less caustic than the one that we're in right now. It was definitely, like, I was 7 or 8 when that song came out, and it was for sure, like, you turned that song on. If your parents put that song on, the Chablis was coming out, the turquoise was going on, you know what I mean? Like the sun was setting, the dominoes were coming out, the steak was going onto the grill. Like, it immediately made the sound of Kenny G immediately, and like others of that era, it immediately like turned adults of that era into like different people. And we always talk, Karen, about like how our parents, you know, sort of went to the disco and did all these other things. There was certain music that your parents, you know, if your parents are like boomers, they would put this music on and it immediately put them into a sense of like joie de vivre. I'm very bad at French, obviously, but you know what I meant. And that's why and then I said, okay, let's talk about yacht rock, and let's talk, or soft rock at spago rock. And the reason I think spago rock is so interesting, I'm glad that we're having this discussion, is because when you think of spago rock, especially if you live in Los Angeles or if you're a Californian, there was a sense that this restaurant in the 80s really had a commitment to like the 80s thing. Like, as you saw in that video, like when they go to dinner in the Player, it's just, or lunch, it's like John Cusack, it's like Burt Reynolds, it's Cher, it's all these people that back in the day, I believe people used to go out like that and just run into stars because it was elite. Today, you'd be lucky if you went to like Rail Food Daily and saw like a TikToker and like, you don't get that kind of star power anymore at these restaurants. And I guess maybe because we're back open, Hollywood is reopened, I kind of want us to talk about this, obviously, and talk about a moment in time where being a celebrity had the kind of cachet that us plebeians would like. Like, I want a table at Spago without having to wait. I want them to know my name or know my voice when I call. Of course, Mrs. Mitchell, it's 8:00, like always. Anyway, that was my point.
Well, I mean, I think it'll be good for us to begin by just briefly parsing. I'm going to do just like a brief parsing of the distinction that I see between soft rock, yacht rock, and Spago rock. And I'm going to have Molly chime in too once we get to the yacht part of it to see if she agrees with me. But, first of all, it's only appropriate that you bring up this sense of luxury or this sense of, affluence as something that applies to all of this music, all three subgenres, tonally. It's like, okay, there's something relaxing and slightly luxurious about this stuff. And, as radio formats, like, or as a thing that was backdated called soft rock, easy listening, soft rock, etc., increasingly in the 70s and 80s, this adult contemporary or album oriented rock, these formats were increasingly pitched to people who were very comfortable, often in the suburbs, right? And often also to women who were responsible for actually determining household budgets at that moment in the 70s and into the 80s. And so, you had your singer songwriter oriented rock or like folk influenced rock. So when I think about soft rock in particular, I see it as more connected to rock proper, right? I browsed Time Life soft rock collection because I was like, okay, what do people consider as belonging to this category? And it's very Foreigner heavy, Chicago, REO Speedwagon, and there's probably, soft rock, though it is soft, certainly has balladry involved in it. You could think of like your Richard Marx. I think anybody who has any kind of slightly, more rock oriented tendency, it fits within the soft rock category. And of course, the categories yacht and Spago came later. Molly, do you want to talk a little bit about your understanding of yacht rock in particular, and what that is, and why we refer to a certain genre of music that way?
Sure. I mean, to me, yacht rock is it has to sound like something you could listen to on a yacht. So that implies the kind of like the breeziness, the sense of luxury that you were talking about, that kind of like 70s, 80s, like America's on top and it's never going to end. Just everything's going to go up forever. But I also think the difference between soft rock and yacht rock to me is that soft rock tends to be very sort of like white, for lack of a better word. And I think that yacht rock, a lot of what people call yacht rock is really just sort of like funk and R&B music that's made by white musicians. Because there's a lot of music that's also, considered R&B or Quiet Storm, that to me would overlap with yacht, except that I think people have this very narrow definition of yacht as like Michael McDonald. That's it.
Well, absolutely. And it's like soft rock, which is a backdated term. It's something that was applied to music, later in the 70s to music that happened before, from 1968 to about like the late 70s. Yacht rock is also a term that didn't emerge until 2005 with the Yacht Rock YouTube show, essentially, and it sort of reframed a lot of what, Molly, you were referring to as kind of blue-eyed soul, or efforts at R&B, crossover R&B by white artists. What it did was it effectively kind of sonically segregated that stuff from Quiet Storm and R&B proper, those other genres, and it created this kind of like bearded Michael McDonald, Kenny Loggins boat adjacent fantasy.
But I think there's two different people though, KT and the rest of the group. There's Michael McDonald, there's Michael McDonald pre-running scared, and there's Michael McDonald post-running scared. Just like the
Doobie Brothers era Michael McDonald, and then solo.
Exactly, Mike.
Yeah.
And then there's Kenny Loggins pre-Danger Zone. Maybe there's Kenny Loggins pre-I'm All Right. I don't know. But there's definitely a schism between just sort of leaning into the 80s and anything goes. I'm happy to sit here on the end of the bow of this boat and drink a Corona. And then there's like, oh no, we've got tables at Spago tonight. We can't make that. We gotta go. Like we got this going on, and then we got a session at the record plant, and then it's Spago all night.
Yeah,
we can't do that.
He moves from being something that's sort of more in the soft rock tradition, more about the laid backness, to that kind of 80s cocaine, big city, bright lights, what we're all talking about.
Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to turn to next, Mike, is that like the Winter anatomizing the pre-Danger Zone Kenny Loggins, the post, right? That there is something inherent in Spago Rock that you see is having to do with a certain exploration of maturity. So do explain to us, Mike, give us your capsule def of this thing called Spago Rock.
Well, just to note on Kenny Loggins, he fits into all three categories because Loggins and Messina, his original duo that he kind of was renowned for, was putting out soft rock records throughout the 70s that are really good, by the way. And then there is the stuff that happens in the 80s and late 80s, and that's sort of where you get into what we now call Spago. So just to define it, and I can provide you with sort of the origin story in a bit, but just from a kind of a musical definition, I think of Spago Rock as organic soul played with synthetic instruments. And I'm looking at a time period that is roughly 1986 to 1993. So what you're seeing during that period of time is that a lot of the musicians who kind of cut their teeth in the late 60s, early 70s are now kind of entering their 40s, and they've all made it to a certain extent. I think a major distinction with Spago Rock is that this wasn't for newcomers, right? These were established musicians who had already had big hits and were now, entering their 40s, trying to stay relevant because are all these murmurings on the charts. And I think what's really interesting is that, Spago is sort of the last genre before kind of hip hop really starts to dominate, right? So it's kind of the last gasp of the kind of classic rock generation making an attempt to stay relevant by, kind of applying all of these cutting edge digital kind of production techniques, but at the same time, they're trying to write hits, right? And they're coming from an era where it was all about soul. And I think there's a big Motown connection with Spago Rock, because there's this kind of synthesized attempt at soul in some songs, very literally. And so what you have is, these guys like, members of the Eagles or Steve Winwood, who had been around for decades and are now like, who at that point in time would have thought that, a rocker past the age of 40 would be able to stay relevant. So these guys are desperately trying to keep making hits and stay relevant. And what are the big production techniques at the time, which is heavy synthesized gated drums, all of the Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis stuff, what Janet Jackson is doing at the time. And so that's where I think you get the amalgam of sounds that I think of as Spago Rock. And I would say that it's kind of a big tent genre. It's not, it's this very particular sound, because it's more that it was, where was the artist at in their career? And if they had been around for a while and they were still making records by the late 80s, early 90s, they were at least probably dabbling in Spago for, a track or two, if not an album. So that's sort of my encapsulated definition.
So I just really quick, I'm going through, as you're speaking, Mike, about like from 86 to 88, because I really feel like this is a crucial time where
93, 86 to 93.
86 to 93. Okay. I'm looking at the beginning because I'm trying to show a downtrend, right? Because to me, by the time, in my opinion, because I was 13 in 93, by the time we got to 93, we were already cruising past the tubular bells, like the ancient.
Totally.
What is
Totally.
that everybody chanting the Gregorian chant?
The Gregorian
Yeah,
chant.
Oh, I mean, I think the cutoff is essentially grunge, right? It's
Right.
murdered by grunge
Mhm.
because it
That's
exists.
92.
It exists as like a counterpoint to hair metal in the 80s as this sort of like sophisticated rock music, not for dummies like hair metal. It's for like a thinking man's synthesizer horn. It's funny that you also came to this genre and called it Spago Rock because I also made a series of mixes with my brother called Glass Bricks that are basically the same idea, based around my brother and I's like childhood in Los Angeles and sort of this idea of like the wealthy guy who came here in the 60s and is still here in the 80s and has like sold his soul. But also sort of that peak of the studio period before grunge. Again, the idea that like the more money you spend on things, the better it's going to be and the more it's going to sell, which was also just happening like across culture in the 80s, like in the movie business too, just like spend. That means it's going to be amazing, which is like obviously not how it works, but kind of what you were saying about like the Eagles solo careers are a really interesting sort of array of the Spago Rock glass brick ethos. I really like a lot of the Eagles solo stuff.
One of the songs we discussed the most in that thread on Twitter was that we started having fun with is Sunset Grill by Don Henley.
Yeah.
If you're talking about, and it has some of those signature tones, like the kind of course, the growling saxophone, the kind of horny, echoey guitar. And
very horny for sure.
There's a lot of, I call it half chub horny guitars.
I love that. It also came out in 1982, the same year that Spago opened. So I would consider it proto Spago, definitely.
So it was like a template. Was it 82 or 84?
Oh,
like
you know what? I'm sorry.
era.
I think you are right. I think it's 84. It's his one of his first solo records.
Because there's something also about like the technology of the song. You know what? I'm going to give us just a little listen so we can react to it. Okay, so first of all, thematically, it's really appropriate. Like Sunset Grill presages the emergence of Spago, practically.
100%.
And then about the Auburn sky, which I was going to bring up because the smog was so bad that it was Auburn literally 24 hours a day.
Stage 4 smog alerts.
Right.
But also, like sonically, what you have is that wily sliding around bass.
Yeah.
Like the kind of like almost trying to mimic whale sounds in some way, Save the Whales in the 80s. And then you have like, that like the crotchy chords in the beginning, and then like, just like there's like an effort at horn sounds, right? Like
this kind of like
trumpets. Go ahead, Molly.
It's like Armani suit rock, it's like the musical equivalent of an Armani suit. And yeah, I mean, like my brother and I talk about Sunset Grill all the time. It's probably one of the songs that made us be like, what is a glass brick? Like to us, what does that mean? Like in terms of a song, because we were talking about specifically Sunset Grill. But I think, it's also just like this peak of the record business. It's like all these kind of like David Geffen discoveries going into, as you said, sort of like their golden year period, and they all made so much money because it's that era of boomers, and the people who didn't make that much money, I don't think made quite the same kind of music.
It's interesting. I would counter that Sunset Grill to me, like, while it has all of these earmarks, it's an album cut. Like, it's not a hit, right? It's too slow to be a hit. It's a little dour. And
6 minutes and 30 seconds long.
and it's
Yeah.
how it's epic. I mean, I will give Don Henley credit because to write a song about a restaurant is pretty challenging. Like, how many songs can you name that are about restaurants that are really good? Scenes from an Italian Restaurant by Billy Joel? I don't know.
A lot of
You know?
them are by Don Henley now that I think about it.
But so this to me is like, is all right, I have an album, I got to fill it out, I have to write at least 10 tracks. Oh, let's have one that's 6 minutes long and it's about a restaurant. And so the difference, if we want to split hairs, it's like that song was never really going to be a hit. It was never going to be a single. Whereas like A Higher Love or King of Wishful Thinking by Go West are completely obvious, like, let's aim for the cheap seats kind of hits. And I think that that's also something that's interesting about Spago, is that it's kind of like, these guys are really trying to go for it, and really that relevance. And I think that, a song like this is definitely like, I think it's canon, right? It's definitely in that proto thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the difference in the micro genres that we invented is, to me, a glass brick has to be strictly West Coast. It has to be influenced by the West Coast sound. It has to be an artist who's identified predominantly with Los Angeles. In California, people who were in big 60s bands and who stuck around, or like you were saying, people who came over from England and the British invasion and were like, the sun is out here, everyone's beautiful, I'm going to stay here for the rest of my life eating ice cream and making AOR. What you're talking about with Spago rock, I feel like overlaps a little bit with what I think of as American Psycho rock.
Yes.
Which is
Yes, I was going to say that.
a
Yes.
similar genre, the Dorsia rock maybe being like the East Coast version of Spago rock, but that same idea of like, I'm a big shot, I'm the producer from The Player and I can get this table because of who I am.
The music is never like, it's never like it takes more power than the background. It takes more power than what's happening in the foreground, right? Like, it's firmly background music. So it's not necessarily, I think, designed to do anything more than enhance the experience at hand. So if you're high on coke, it's enhancing this experience. Remember, we were at Spago and I did like 7 lines and they were playing. No one was like, oh, Steve Winwood was playing in the background. Like, it enhances the experience. I don't think that it was necessarily designed to be more iconic than sort of what the experience was allowing for. That's my opinion.
And no, that's a good point, because when I first kind of came up with this idea, which is, believe it or not, 20 years ago, the criteria was, could this be played in Spago? Now, full disclosure, like, I live in New York. I grew up on Long Island. I've never been to Spago, right? So there's a whole, and the next time I'm in Los Angeles, I expect that we're all going to go. But so a lot of this is, there's a fantasy element to this, right? And this goes into the whole origin story, but initially the idea is this the kind of thing that I could be here played in insert name of trendy restaurant here, and it was just Spago, right? Likewise, it's, could this artist, be seen eating at Spago, right? That was sort of the initial, like, this is what classifies as Spago rock.
Right.
But for me, like, oh, so go ahead, Molly, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, right. It's like this idea of what adult life will be like that you develop when you're younger.
Exactly.
And that's what
100%.
the adults are like. And you think, when I'm an adult, this is what it'll be like. And then you're an adult and it's like a completely different world. But your reference point for the good life is still Spago. And I completely feel this way, because I do think there are restaurants you could go to now if you wanted to see famous people. I think Nobu Malibu is probably the one that's like the modern day equivalent of Spago in terms of like sheer celebrity sightings. And in a way, Spago is quaint because it's so like food focused. It's not about the view even of the famous people. It's like, it really got popular because of the food, which I'll explain in a moment, I had yesterday for weird reasons. The food is really good at Spago.
It
It
is.
it is not overrated.
Mm-mm.
It's hard to remember that given, how Wolfgang Puck, just as a concept, also we've seen him just, suddenly be in grocery stores or in airports, or like, the Wolfgang Puck brand has been stretched out in various ways. So it's almost hard to remember the glory days of him as a kind of culinary innovator.
Right.
But
He's so famous, and it's gotten not watered down, but just like, the idea of California cuisine, the idea of thin crust pizza with non-traditional toppings, these things are like not controversial anymore at all. But at the time, it was seen as like you're completely breaking with tradition of what people think pizza is and what they think fine dining is, in a way that's like not bad, I think. I don't think it is like that. To me, the bad 80s food is the stuff that's like the portion is tiny and it just has like squiggles on it.
Right.
Like the Wolfgang Puck food is still food. It's just this kind of like high and low.
Oh, and it's hearty. I practically lived off of Wolfgang Puck's cuisine for a good 10 years from when I started working in entertainment. Any place I went to, if it was a private party, if it was a screening, if it was a after party or an event, it was catered by Wolfgang Puck. So you were eating like mini hamburgers 3-4 times a week. You were having like, Szechuan egg rolls. Like, it just got to the point where it's like your palate became so attuned to the Wolfgang Puck way of eating that it's like establishment. I feel like such a snob because I went to probably the only time I will ever go to J-Lo's Christmas party, but I went once and he was catering it. And he was just in the kitchen making food. And it's just like, to me, that is like so freaking rich. You're so rich that you took a man out of like his empire during probably one of the busier times of the season, holiday parties up the wazoo, to have him come and just start, shoving pizzas into your
That's what he loves to do, though. Yeah. So I went to Spago yesterday, completely unrelated to this podcast. We had already planned this podcast, I think, like a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah.
My friend Vanessa's father was an LA chef named Mark Peel, who just passed away. He was one of the first chefs. He came up at Spago. And so the memorial was held at Spago for like family and friends yesterday afternoon. And it was just really interesting because it was like everyone who had ever worked at Spago was there. They're very much like this kind of, family of people that have all known each other forever and that have all worked in every, sort of high-end LA restaurant. But they're all chefs. They're not like actors. It's like they all just like love to cook food. And that's such an interesting type of person to me.
Yeah, I mean, and Mark Peel, Nancy Silverton, Evan Funke, I think that's how you pronounce it. I don't know if it's funk or funky, but like,
either way, it's a cool.
Either way, it's funky. But yeah, it's true. There was of course like a kind of authentic impetus to the kind of food there.
Mark Peel wasn't as famous of a chef as like Wolfgang Puck. He was around a lot of very famous chefs, but he was a real kind of like chef who really just loved to cook food. And when I think about like, because I do love California cuisine, I love Cal Med, all that stuff, to think that like at the time it was sort of innovative to go with like vegetable forward, local produce forward food, because the idea of fancy food for so long had just been like the most expensive steak and like the richest cream sauce, you know?
Right.
I'm such a Californian that just like, I prefer the thin crust pizza.
I think what's interesting is that, like, again, to talk about like the Spago Rock origin story. I mean, it didn't need to be Spago, right? Like it could have been any place, because for me, it was growing up on Long Island, early 90s. Not at this point, I'd never been to Los Angeles. So my reference points were films and TV. And it's funny that The Players come up like 3 times so far, because that was such an influential movie for me, because it painted this picture that Los Angeles was a place where you just always went to lunch to meet your agent. It was always dusk, right? And there was always this kind of like smooth, kind of sort of corporate-y rock just playing in the background. And my real life experience with that, and why this is personal to me, is that my parents' best friends at that time, still very close friends, were a couple named Howard and Leslie, and they lived in a town called Roslyn, which is sort of a shishi place on Long Island. And they had the contemporary house with the Nagel prints on the wall, and like the white Formica, the beige, the terracotta tiles.
Did they have glass bricks?
They definitely had the glass bricks. They had the glowing orb, like the lightning, where you could put your hand on it, and the lightning, the
sharper image.
Lightning. Yeah, it was amazing. But they also had a stereo that would always be playing at like a deafening volume. Like, didn't matter what it was just always so incredibly loud. And it was always stuff like, Whitney Houston and Madonna, and stuff that kind of like, there are definitely connections to Spago, but I wouldn't necessarily consider them, Spago. But anyway, the idea is that when I kind of put it together that like, oh, I don't know from Los Angeles, I'm 12, 13 years old, but Howard and Leslie are like what I think it's like out there. And these people actually exist. They're not just made up for TV shows and for movies. Like, there is an East Coast kind of version of this. And the amazing thing is that when their older daughter had her bat mitzvah, and this was probably 1990, it was at the Copacabana in New York, which is, this historic nightclub. And it was just like, it was incredible. Like, probably one of the best parties I've ever been to. And I was 11, right? And it was just what they were probably playing, what the DJs were playing, is a lot of what we would consider Spago rock now, because this was 1990. That was sort of the height. So a lot of this goes back to like my interpretation of what Los Angeles sophistication is when I'm like, a yet very young teenager, and I'm this naive, innocent kid. So much of it is this fantasy. And obviously I'm not thinking, I don't know what Spago is at this point. Right. And then it's about 10 years later, I was in college, and I was, my roommate and I think maybe Pretty Woman was on, or the song King of Wishful Thinking by Go West came on. And that to me is one of the kind of touchstone songs of Spago rock. And we were just talking, and like, I was just like, this is like Spago rock. I just came out. And then like, that was sort of the genesis, and it tied together all of that stuff from my youth of like, seeing this stuff on TV, but also having these family friends that sort of embodied it. And it all came together, and I've just been sitting on it for years until.
Well, the fantasy element, I want to return to the fantasy element real quick that we've been discussing, because we started to go deep into what Spago actually was, and, and its centrality to kind of, LA culture, and, and beyond California culture. But there's something about the fantasy element of Spago rock to me that is mostly middle-aged guy, right? And when I look through the Spago playlist that you put together for Spotify, there aren't that many kind of female artists that organically kind of fit into like the sort of touchstone sounds that you're talking about, like Steve Winwood.
Because it's a yuppie fantasy, right? It's like it's a yuppie fantasy, and it's a power fantasy, and the fantasy is about being a straight white guy at the top of the world during the last time that would like ever mean anything. And like The Player, like you were saying, The Player, it doesn't mean you necessarily want to be a yuppie in any way. It just means that that's like what you thought of as the good life when you were younger. And there's also been some stuff recently about cocaine decor, sort of people moving away from, mid-century modern stuff into this sort of like fantasist glass coffee table, kind of yuppie 80s stuff. And to me, I think it's like that nobody can afford to like have a house or anything. So people are returning to this sort of like fantasy of like, what did I think adult life looked like when I was a kid versus like the reality of it, where like I am not eating at Spago.
No, I agree with that. I mean, I think that, to be fair, there were songs by female artists like Taylor Dane or Kathy Tricoli or Janet Jackson, who I always kind of put into Spago canon. But there's no denying that like the main thrust of this is coming from that sort of generation of like kind of classic rock men, and that's why, quite frankly, the Twitter thread that we all initially got involved in that talked about this idea of Lady Spago and using the Bonnie Raitt song "Nick of Time," which is also like a touchstone, is so interesting to me because, if you can't see me on this podcast, I'm a white male in his early 40s, like who grew up with a lot of those classic rock artists and still generally enjoy that. So that's a lot of that is my experience. So that's why it's so interesting to take the tact of like, looking at something like Spago rock from different cultures. And I think that that's where like the soul aspect of it, because, a lot of it is indebted to R&B and soul. It's just and if you look at what was going on there at the time, it was also using a lot of the same production techniques, right? Everybody was kind of going for this synthesized digital big drum sound. So that was just what was going on, in popular music at the time. But I think, again, this idea of it like being this big tent thing, where there are a lot of all sorts of different artists kind of dabbled in it at some point in their career, if it was long enough, is also like, an important thing to remember.
I'm wondering if it's sort of like, if it became like a genre that, even though we've like, you guys have given it this name, and Mike, you came up with the idea of Spago rock and it's sort of taken off. I wonder if they started making music just so that, I imagine that they get money from having these songs or playlists licensed and played constantly over and over. Am I wrong? Like
no. Like if these songs are still being played in a public, broadcast, public performance, they're generating performance royalties. And it's funny, when I looked at some of the songs on the playlist as I'm adding them, like here's an example. I was debating on what Paul Simon song to include, because Paul Simon's Graceland and Rhythm of the Saints, the two records that fit in the Spago timeline, actually like aren't very Spago like as whole albums. But You Can Call Me Al is like a friend said to me, the video is so Spago, like it should be served with a side of Chilean sea bass. Like the video with Chevy Chase and the pink and everything, it is so Spago. And that song has like, almost 400 million plays on Spotify, which makes it, I think, probably the most popular song on the playlist. And I was wondering, does it belong? But the sound of that song, if you remember, begins with like these synthesized horns, and it's very funky for Paul Simon. So, it had to go in because as sort of like, this exhaustive, like, let's try to put it all in here. Hopefully, not too much bad stuff, because it's stuff that, I want to be able to listen to. But yeah, make no mistake about it. Like a lot of these songs were very big hits, and there are people, that still like that, Steve Winwood is still getting a healthy royalty for Higher Love, which came out in 1986, every quarter. Let's just put it that way, from, his performing rights organization.
Let's listen to some of these Spago horns. I'm actually going to, in my mind, Go West, I always, King of Wishful Thinking certainly is one of those songs. It's probably their best known because of its, cinematic role. But their first album, their entire first album, was filled with songs that sounded like this. And We Close Our Eyes is truly, I think, probably most indicative, again, something that anticipated that Spago aesthetic.
To let go, and while we
Okay.
I like it.
Hey,
I
Mike,
like it. Sorry.
I call this montage music. This is montage music. This is music that's playing when a nerd is going from not to hot. And you're like, no, not that shirt, this shirt.
So I'm not as familiar. We haven't talked as extensively about Glass Brick tunes or music, but my guess is the one of the fine distinctions beyond the ones that you already named about like the necessity of it being West Coast is that there's something more noirish about Glass Brick rock than maybe.
I think there's something a little like sinister about it. It's sort of this idea of like you came to LA to make it and then you sold your soul in the 80s, but you like have this mansion made of glass bricks now. It's funny because I don't think of Go West in the same category. There's like another made up genre called sophistopop that I learned about from All Music Guide in the 90s. That is like the European version to me. It's more like, I don't know, it's maybe a little more drum
like
machine-y.
Tears for Fears.
Yeah, exactly. And
Style
I made
Council.
I've made a bunch of mixes sort of around that too. And I made one that was like a sophistopop mix. And then the guy who invented the term was like, that's not a real genre. He's like, I made that up when I worked at All Music. And I was like, it is now.
Oh, I've heard it. I mean, sophistopop is something that I too always associated with predominantly UK artists, sort of coming out of new wave, right? So they were probably a little
like
younger than the
Swing
Spago
Out
guys.
Sister.
Yeah,
who are definitely crossover with Spago. But I want to say to what Molly was saying about and what you guys were saying about the sinister aspect of it. I think this is a great distinction between Spago and yacht rock. Obviously, besides the time periods, to me, yacht rock was always about good times, good vibes, right? It was very kind of relaxing. It wasn't challenging from a lyrical perspective for the most part. And then, Spago takes on, there's this more of a contemplation in the lyrics, precisely because a lot of these songwriters were now, in their 40s, maybe their glory days were behind them. Maybe there were a couple of, there was some alimony, maybe there were all sorts of stories there, right? There was more of kind of a, this idea that, it's not going to last forever. And that's one of the things that I always, that I saw as a distinction between the two is that while there's a lot of Spago that is, the music is almost always upbeat, right? Another distinction back with Sunset Grill, the music is always kind of like major chords, kind of upbeat, but the lyrics tend to take on, heavier, messages than what I would say with yacht rock.
Genesis, throwing it all away. I feel like that's like core in that mode, but also like, yacht, like we're thinking like yacht rock, it was dated between 72 through about 84, 85. And, soft rock kind of is like just an umbrella category that's like 68 all the way into the contemporary moment. Power ballads are part of that as well. And it is a little more American and also a little bit more working class in certain moments. But I love that, like, that there's enough, we're taking the time to pay enough attention to these small distinctions in theme and sound and production that happen in that giant synthesized swath of the 80s from like 84 to the 90s.
I think it's important to note that like clearly Mike and I both have a lot of love for this music. It's not just like a cynical, like,
not
here's what dumb rich people listen to. It's like, I like all these songs. Just like I like that Chinese chicken salad from Spago. And I learned, actually, I went down a whole rabbit hole about Chinese chicken salad recently.
Chinois chicken salad, you mean?
Yes, well, no, it's invented by, it's a totally LA thing, and it was invented by this restaurateur named Sylvia Wu, who had one of the first trendy Chinese bistros in LA. She was like a Chinese immigrant who built this Chinese restaurant empire in Los Angeles. And the story, and then she hobnobbed with stars. There's like all these pictures of her with Cary Grant. She had like a Rolls Royce with the license plate Madame Wu. And she's mentioned in a Steely Dan song, I believe. But she also invented the Chinese chicken salad based on this idea of like, what do people in Los Angeles want to eat? They want things that are like light and vegetable forward. And it was based on a salad she remembered having had in Shanghai once. And it became this like signature LA item. It was just something where I was like, oh, that's so interesting. I'd never thought about it, but now that I'm thinking about it, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, I mean, it does. Like I always associated it primarily with Wolfgang Puck and like have like a lot of salad mythologies where
right.
like where it's like somebody had to like fashion something together out of what was left over in the kitchen.
Well, it was Madame Wu, and I like that he picked up on that sort of LA tradition. I'm sure that he was familiar with her restaurant because she had sort of the premier trendy restaurant in LA in like the 70s in Santa Monica.
Well, so Winter, actually, I wanted to ask, I mean, what were your fantasies of LA as somebody in the Bay Area? Did you have any at all? Like, were they consonant with what Mike is talking about? Like, there's a kind of, you're in a similar age range. Like, did you have like that aspirational LA fantasy at all? And what did it look like?
We lived here from 84 to 86. So I got like, and my parents were not, I mean, my parents are super hip, but they weren't like in the scene like that. So my goal when I got here was to be in the scene, which I think I did a pretty goddamn good job of it. But, we would drive up and down Sunset Boulevard and we would drive into Beverly Hills and we did all the things that you do. They wanted to show us like what the city was. I was like too little and too young to know. But my dreams when I was there was supported by the fact that, think about 1984 LA, it was lifestyles of the rich and famous. You would see celebrities in places, but it wasn't like we didn't see celebrities in places that you would normally see them out. Like we would see them at the grocery store. We would see my sister, Danny DeVito played with my sister at the Children's Museum. Like those are on planes. We see them at the airport because we're always at the airport. But it's like I didn't have, all I had of that Los Angeles sort of vibe was what I got from MTV, what I got from Entertainment Tonight, what I got from like when those things like mattered. And it's so funny that we're now in a world where those things just, I don't watch ET. There is, Robin is dead. Robin is gone. He's dead. And then we also just don't see, action. When you look at Sunset Boulevard these days, it's dead. There's nothing going on there. There's the places that are the hot spots. Chateau has 90% less staff than it used to. A lot of these new hotels have gone up in places that are really iconic and legendary. Venues are just starting to open up, but it's not the same energy or the same vibe. And so when I think of like, Spago Rock, when I think of like all of these places and sort of like the legacy they created, it really is of a time. Like, I don't think we're going to go 20 years into the future. It's also of like being really committed to ambiance and being committed to experience. Because I don't think we're going to fast forward 20 years into the future and think about like Delilah's, where like Amelia Rena Hamlin goes and be like, oh, remember that like the baby song? Like, it's like no one's gonna be like, oh, the baby rock. Like, it's not, that's just not what the commitment to experience that no longer exists.
But Winter, it's really interesting that you make that point, because I think going back again, there's definitely a nostalgic thing with Spago Rock. But if you look at those songs, like there was more of a monoculture back then, right? You didn't have all of these options. People mainly listened to the radio, right? Or you bought records, tapes, or CDs. You didn't have infinite options. And I think also, while the idea of like, music has changed dramatically over the past, 40 years, but people always need a place to eat. Like restaurant, you still have to go to a restaurant to eat or take it out, right? Take it out, right? Take it to go. But with music, there are so many different ways now to consume it and so many more channels and micro genres that, whatever the number one song is on the Billboard Top 100 charts, I guarantee you, like, I've never heard it, right? Like, but the number one song back in, 1990, we've all heard it, right? It was just more of this kind of a monoculture. And I think that's one of the things that, it's also like, hearkening back for this innocent time when you were a kid and you're looking up at what this innocent idea of what sophistication is and what your parents are doing and what they're listening to. And that plays like, I guess I should say this, like, just the last point I was going to make is just like, there won't be like any contemporary artists making Spago rock, maybe with the sole exception of myself, which I put on my own playlist is just a purely promotional thing, Simmons and Mateo. But other than that, like, it's sort of like it is of a time, and that time.
Right.
I don't know. I think John Mayer's trying to bring it back right now. That's like his
Bring it back. Yeah, I get it.
Here's the question: do you think he can carry it? You think he could do it for an entire album, or is it just that song,
No,
which is a good song?
I think that he's manipulative and a predator, and this is exactly how he gets women, by pretending to be sensitive and caring about.
By telling them their bodies are a wonderland and like over dulcet guitar tones.
But he doesn't know he's making Spago rock just yet, right?
No, he does. He does, because his new album is specifically called Soft Rock, and it's themed like an 80s album. It's themed like an 80s mid-career artist AOR album. It's completely Spago rock. In fact, the aesthetics.
That's true. I'm just wondering. No, it's great. I just wonder if he actually knows what Spago rock is yet, or maybe after this podcast comes out, he
but
will.
I'm sure he would understand. And I think that what you were saying too is also just like during the pandemic, I think everybody was just very nostalgic for the idea of like restaurant ambience in general. Like I definitely listened to some YouTubes that were just ambiance YouTubes of like the sound of glasses clinking. Amazing. And like other people having conversation. So there's something I think it's like, instead of being sort of the alienating American Psycho version of that fantasy, it's definitely like the warm, intimate version of that fantasy. And again, like I went to Spago yesterday. It's the second time I've ever been there in my life. Smoked salmon pizza is super good, but I also saw this one guy they were like handing out appetizers, and this one guy was like, I'll take the whole tray.
That's Spago energy.
Tater tots with caviar. And I was like, that guy is the king of Spago.
Yep. Spago energy. Mad Spago energy.
Well, on the note of I'll take everything on that platter, I mean, it's obvious that we can't cover everything on the menu today. I've had so much fun like diving into this with both of you.
Thank you. I will say I tried to explain Spago rock to a number of people at Spago yesterday, and they did not know what
no clue.
That's the end goal. I mean, the end goal is I'd like to DJ there one night. I mean, that's
because they're too inside. They can't hear. They're too inside. They're plugged into the matrix. So so that's part of it. But Molly Lambert, Mike Pace, do you all want to plug anything before you take off? And before we, wrap up our show for the week?
Sure. Yeah. You can find me at Molly Lambert on Twitter and at Molly_Lambert on Instagram. And I have a podcast coming out in the fall called Heidi World about Hollywood Madam Heidi Fleiss that will certainly cover some aspects of the Spago lifestyle.
That'll be really good.
That sounds amazing.
That's going to be great. Well, we have to have you back once that comes out.
Please.
I'm Mike E. Pace at just on Instagram and Twitter. The playlist on Spotify, if you're looking for it, if you just type in Mike Pace Spago Rock Sampler. And I make music under the name Simmons and Mateo, and there's some tracks on there. And reach out if there's anything that you consider Spago. Like I'd love to hear from people and add stuff to the playlist. I'm always adding things, and it was really great. Thank you guys. Again, you beat the New York Times Popcast to the punch in terms of breaking the Spago on the podcast
we broke verses a couple of years ago anyway too. So anyway, that was our original format for the show. Anyway, not that like we trademarked that or anything, but like no one can think of that concept. But we always joke that Winter is extremely clairvoyant, and so there we go. Well, thank you both, and we'll be right back right after this.
Waiting to exhale. Waiting to exhale.
Welcome back to Waiting to Exhale. And Nuolingo, Winter, is one that I'm kind of curious about. Like, this sounds like a very useful term.
It's kind of depressing. It's pandemic fine. Sarah Smith at Sarah E. Smith 23 on Twitter. She created this a mere 4 days ago, which I appreciate. I want to thank at Sarah E. Smith 23 for creating this. Pandemic fine, she says, is a noun. It is defined as a state of being in which you are employed and healthy during a pandemic, but you're also tired and depressed and feel like trash all the time.
That's amazing. No, I mean, that's very descriptive of, any of us who were lucky enough to not be frontline folks and who made it relatively, I guess, on the surface unscathed through this process, but are actually extremely scathed.
Yeah.
Psychically, I like that pandemic fine. And it's also like, it's acknowledging the mental health toll that we just haven't been able to tap into.
Right. 100%.
Because also like, it's so weird seeing people anew and having them ask, how are you doing?
I'm like,
well, how, like, what do you say? I mean, now I'm going to say, pandemic fine, but what is it that you say when people ask that question? You're like, I always just say, well, and that's it.
I say I'm flummoxed and confused, which is what I really am. I don't know about you, KT, but I've had to go out a lot lately, and people either have completely flouted the courtesies that we should be afforded and extended as I shouldn't have to walk around with a V on my chest or a not yet V on my chest to remind people to have a common courtesy that we're in the middle of a pandemic. So I don't want to hug you, shake your hand, close talking. And people are just, and it's really weird energy. So I just say, I literally say I'm flummoxed and confused. And I make allowances for it, that I'm not really 100%. I think I want to see you. I told you I want to go and come see you. But I want to see people like I have a relationship with. I don't want to see new people.
Yeah, it's true. That's what,
and I've had to see a lot of new people lately, and it's really annoying.
Yeah, I will say the one thing I love about pandemic fine as the new lingo too is that it kind of like registers some level of survivor's guilt.
Yeah.
Yes. Right. And so I do think that there's a lot of that so many volumes of that we haven't even begun to tap into. But yeah, I want to see you too, even though I did feel like I went to Musso the other night, which and Musso and Frank, and like I said, when I texted you the picture of my food, which looked very yummy, I was like, here's my delicious food, probably with a side of Delta variant, because people are open mouth coughing, not covering their mouths.
Yes.
Like I was just like, yo, we just went through like a really terrible global pandemic, and you're telling me you can't remember to cover your mouth when you cough or sneeze.
That's fucking weird, dude. It's weird.
It's gross. Also, I was somewhere else the other day, and some gross man came right up into my face, maskless. I was maskless too, because we were like on a patio somewhere watching the soccer, and this dude is like, "Where are you from?" And I'm like, and I knew he was like trying to get at what kind of Asian are you? And then I was like, it's like, are you asking me because I'm Asian and you want to know what kind of Asian I am? I literally said this to him, and he's like, well, yes, and I was like, he's like, I love Asian culture. And I was like, no, you don't ask somebody that, especially with your mouth uncovered.
No, go away. Go away. I think you can be rude now. I think I'm actually really open to just out and right rudeness in defense of my protecting my bubble. So just do what you got to. Just carry some mace, KT. That's all I'm saying.
I know. I'm just like, don't. Yeah. Like, word of advice: if any of you ever see me on the street, don't be like, "Where are you from?" This guy was from South Africa, a white, like 50-something South African man. Anyway, I'm calling you out, guy at the red line who came up to me unmasked. Anyway, on the patio. How dare you?
How dare you?
since this was such a song heavy week, we're not going to leave you with songs of the week. I hope you enjoy all the playlists and links to things we give you to listen to Spago and Glass Brick Rock, Yacht, and Soft. But I did want to leave with a song dedication to someone who we lost, a great luminary in the world of queer studies and academia and cultural criticism, Lauren Berlant, a mentor and a friend whose vanishing from this world is something that truly feels unbearable. Like, how does one work? How does one imagine an intellectual life without this great, great being? So farewell to Lauren. We will miss them. This is a song that we sang together in Chicago a few years ago, and it's called I Want to Be Around.
I want to be around to pick up the pieces when somebody breaks your heart. Somebody twice as smart as I.
You've been listening to Waiting to Exhale, executive produced and hosted by me, Karen Thompson.
And Winter Mitchell-Rohrbaugh.
Our editor and producer is the always amazing and always MacGyvering Allison Holly.
Our theme music, Waiting to Exhale, was composed just for us by Daniel Crawford. Please review us on iTunes. We're everywhere you get your podcasts. So throw us 5 stars anywhere you have a chance to. Did our rating sustained?
I think our rating has sustained. I actually didn't get a chance to cull some new comments. So for those of you who are rating us, if you want to leave a cute comment, we'll read it here on the air. And and we'll read multiples next time around since we didn't get to it this time. We do want to thank everyone who continues to support us on Patreon. We're so honored to receive your support in these troubled and uncertain times. Thanks to Steve Scott for becoming a new member this month. And, honestly, if you love this kind of supersized bonus content that we give you every week, throw a little change our way. We have to give Allison a livable life out there in the heat of Texas. So do support us in whatever way you can. We have new merch, new incentives, and new membership tiers. And your support goes directly, as we said, into producing this show, from the recording and editing to its distribution. Reach out to us via email, Twitter, on Instagram, and visit our merch store, not morch, our merch store, all by visiting w2xpodcast.com. We're on Facebook and all the old familiar places. So make sure to like our W2X Facebook page to keep us up to date, or to keep you up to date, rather, on all the news. Bye.
Bye.
With Karen and Winter. Waiting to exhale. I know you're waiting. Waiting to exhale. I know you're waiting with